Yeah, so we are recording now.
Okay, so we decided to record this little post conversation after our reading groups on Friday because some people were objecting to putting reading groups online, and we were thinking, okay, so we just Vasily, Mitya, and I just talk for half an hour and try to remember the most interesting moments for us that had happened on Friday, so we can share it with others who didn't see it.
So I'll start by presenting the text. This is really nothing new for those who attended the reading group. Basically, the text we chose is the second version of a text that was first gave as a lecture as part of the Malinowski Memorial Lectures at the LSE in 2006. So we are discussing the paper version of it, which was published in the O, which was like a journal co-founded. I mean, David had was involved at the beginning of this paper, of this journal. And there is a third version, which is a bit more readable, I think, more accessible for the public in his book on bureaucracy. And to this, in this version, there is a little bit more reflections on the political implications of his theory of interpretive labor. So and also in other places you can find reflections on political implications in chapter 10 of his book on direct action and in Revolution in Reverse. So we chose this essay because we wanted to address the notion of care, and even though it is not addressed directly in this essay, it is somehow through the notion of interpretive labor. So to care about someone is to imagine the perspectives of that person. David says in this essay quite explicitly, and this definition is always seemed to us a good starting point, a good working definition for the Museum of Care. So well, I'll give the floor to Mitya, who's going to say something about this notion of interpretive labor.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think this paper is important precisely because it sort of weaves together in a very profound way several well, some of the most important concepts that are present in different writings of David Graeber. So one of these concepts is interpretive labor, which is based on, which is sort of derived in part from the feminist theorizing, and he makes that clear in the paper. So the idea of interpretive labor is that interpretation of someone else, of the other, takes work. It takes some sort of temporal and emotional investment. You have to learn a language, you have to understand what some particular person means by certain expressions and so on. So this requires time and energy and creativity and imagination, because to interpret someone, to understand someone, you need to be able to imagine yourself in this person's place. And so one of the profound points of this essay, which also links it to this idea of care, is that in hierarchical relationships, this burden of interpretive labor is distributed unequally. And so those at the bottom of hierarchies tend to invest more time and energy into interpreting their bosses, while their bosses don't have to do that and don't do that. And I think, it's worth thinking about this sort of more structurally, in a sense that hierarchical relationships, they not necessarily determine that someone at the top won't spend any time interpreting those at the bottom, but if you are at the top of some kind of hierarchical relationships, you have less sort of incentives to do that. You have a structural advantage. You can you can just skip that essential work of interpretation because you can force others to do something you want them to. So this is the idea of interpretive labor, and I think there are sort of two connections I'd like to elaborate on. One is that to interpret is to imagine, and this is essential to this very idea of care, because if you care about something, sort of by definition, or about someone, that by definition implies that you try to understand, you spend time to understand, to learn, to imagine yourself in someone else's place, and so on. And if you don't care, it's vice versa. And the other connection is to, and I mentioned that in the reading group, the other connection is to another paper by David Graeber, which is called Modes of Production Inside Out. And I think it's also 2006. And there he makes a very interesting observation, which will sound familiar to most anthropologists, but still is quite profound, that when sort of distant cultures meet for the first time and don't understand each other at all, sort of to speed the process up, people rely on trade and violence as the two sort of impersonal or very simplistic forms of interaction that can be used in situations when, for some reason, there is no it's not possible to really invest time and energy, interpretive labor, to understand the other, right, or others. But so this happens when distant cultures meet for the first time. They engage in trade, for example, or when some empire conquers some other communities. As in the Depp book, he elaborates on that, with this notion of slavery, coinage, industrial complex. But so it also works sort of the other way around, in the opposite direction, in some sort of dialectical, mode, because people who are able to accumulate a lot of money or a lot of means of coercion, warlords, capitalists, by virtue of having a lot of money or a lot of coercion, they can skip interpretive labor. So it's not just trade and violence save time when you don't have time to interpret someone, but also if you have a lot of that, you can just get rid of the very necessity to interpret someone else, because you can force them to do something you want them to, with money or force. So that would be my short intervention.
Okay, now we have decided to kick off with Foucault, and to talk a little bit about the few people David argues against in this paper, which are so basically he's got 2 or 3 punch bags. He's got Foucault, Weber, and Geertz that we can talk a little bit about later on. But it's interesting to start with Foucault because, as we know, the first version of this paper, the lecture version, was called Beyond Power and Knowledge. So with a direct reference to Foucault, and so yeah. Do you want to say something about that, Nika, or should I say something? Yeah. So they just to mention it quickly. He makes some direct reference to it, even in the version we are discussing, when he talks about obviously he talks about them as the only 2 intelligent people in human history who honestly believe that bureaucracy could be efficient, was characterized primarily by its efficiency. So the argument he's making in the first version, but also in the second version, is that this idea that power power necessarily implies knowledge and vice versa is not necessarily true. And as Mitya has just said, it might be true like it might be true between two equally powerful parties, say the Western world versus the USSR during the Cold War, but it's certainly not true if one of the parties is overwhelmingly more powerful. If you're powerful enough, you don't even need to know anything about the other party, which is the case in again, take the example of a patriarchy. You know, if I'm all strong enough to smash my girlfriend's teeth, and then I don't actually need to talk endlessly about you know, problems to solve in our relationships, in our relationship. So so you'll go, Nika, if you want to talk about Foucault, please.
No, I think I will not talk about Foucault, but I will, I will talk about feminism and patriarchal relationship, and
so that was a perfect connect, yeah, perfect,
yeah,
yeah.
And
perfect transition.
Dennis Shep in during reading group mentioned that it's actually very unusual to say that and to mention that what David did was surprising, that actually powers come with stupidity, because interpretive labor is a very creative labor, and if structurally people in a position where they lack possibility to do that, then it's unavoidably pushing them into these dead zones of imagination. And David also mentioned there that so as a torture is a stupidity, as an because it doesn't provide you with the knowledge, and everybody understand that it's totally something else. It's use of the power where you want to finish conversation, you just strike somebody in the head with the stick, and then the conversation is over. Yeah, and in this case, I want to also quote the other person, Yat, from the reading group, who we talk about privacy, and that's actually why we're recording this little video, because many people in our reading group were concerned about privacy, and this is a correct concern, because we are living in an age of total surveillance. And I would like to talk a little bit about that, because it's a fascinating theme. Because the machine who are recording us and can track every move and very efficiently analyze all information, they also lack, by definition, the capacity to care and sensibility and basically knowledge. So, and in this case, maybe my question would be about the definition of knowledge, and coming back to Foucault again.
Mitya, do you want to say something about algorithms here?
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's even though this very sort of argument about interpretive labor apparently was intended partly as a pun, a kind of playful engagement with Foucault, power knowledge, this whole idea of power knowledge, it still has some profound resonances, I think. And so so, you know, basically what Foucauldian power knowledge is about, that in order to govern, you have to know, right? And so, but what Graeber says is that, in a sense, in order to govern, you know, you have to be stupid. And so, you know, probably there's no contradiction, because if you think about some of the examples Foucault gives, or perhaps James Scott in his book about seeing like a state, right? So those schemes that Scott describes sort of standardize the world by introducing certain transparent classificatory grids and material infrastructure that sort of underpins underpins them, systems of measures and weights and homogeneous currencies and homogeneous languages and homogeneous trees in a forest, all that on the one hand allows to rule by knowing things about what is being ruled. So it's a kind of infrastructure that allows knowledge to be generated, but at the same time, as Scott makes clear, right, those infrastructure, those like grand projects that require extensive infrastructures to generate knowledge. They also suppress lots of sort of alternative forms of knowing, implicated in different kinds of pragmatics, different kinds of practical contexts, useful for different kinds of practical purposes.
What Scott calls the métis, right?
Exactly, yeah. And so in that sense, the knowledgeable ruler also has to be stupid, because this very knowledge that he or she needs to in order to rule is only possible because some other knowledge is being suppressed. And so we were mentioning algorithms in the reading group, and just before we started this recording, because algorithms, as are omnipresent now, right? They sort of tacitly govern certain choices we make in the everyday life and so on. And so algorithms, in a sense, are a perfect embodiment of this peculiar sort of dichotomy between knowledge and stupidity being conditions of possibility of power, or perhaps certain forms of power, because an algorithm is, on the one hand, is sort of infinitely knowledgeable because it possesses certainly much more knowledge than any human person can ever possess, right? And is able to see, counterintuitive patterns by virtue of being able to just process huge amounts of data and so on. So that's knowledge, right? But at the same time, it's infinitely stupid because it has no ability to engage in interpretive labor, right? Or perhaps only superficially. And so if we go back to Geertz and this famous example of the difference between a wink and just a reflexive movement of an eye, that's the distinction supposedly only a human person socialized in a certain kind of culture can recognize, and probably algorithms can't, or at least if they can, they do it for wrong reasons, just on the basis of having amassed a huge amount of perhaps photographs or videos with people winking or just reflexively moving their eyes, and on the basis of data analysis to learn how to guess it correctly. But that's also, in a sense, very stupid if you think about it. So that's one of the ways to connect this notion of interpretive labor and knowledge power to sort of some of the broader concerns. And the final thing I wanted to mention here is that we shouldn't perhaps forget that knowledge power, this whole sort of scheme, has its historical boundaries, its limits. So, for instance, much of Foucauldian scholarship is primarily concerned with what they call advanced liberal government, or mode of governing. So it's basically about modern states, or at least to a large extent, it is based on the analysis of modern states. And what I think Graeber points out is that this is a highly unusual sort of thing, because most of the time, for most of people, for most of history, power was based not really on knowledge, but on stupidity and violence. I think I'll stop here.
Isn't it a modern state with its bureaucracy? David called it stupidity and violence too, and specifically bureaucracy he's calling stupidity and violence. No? he started
Yeah,
as
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
um,
I don't insist that my interpretation is correct, but I think so. Part of his point was to just to sort of remind, the readers that this sort of whole Foucauldian fascination with bureaucracy and discipline and all that is very historically limited, because I mean, it's sort of it's debatable, but to some extent I think it's fair to say that these subtle sort of power subtle relationships between power and knowledge that sort of are mutually implying each other are characteristic of certain historical periods, perhaps, but not of power as such. Well, we could probably debate that, but I think he makes it very clear in the paper that ultimately it's all backed by force, by some kind of apparatus of violence, which doesn't necessarily mean that it's all there is, right? Or that it's completely derivative of this force or apparatus of violence. But probably it's more complicated than that. But you can't just ignore, the existence of this apparatus of coercion. And with bureaucracy, I think one of the ways of interpreting it would be to say that, I mean, if you want to sort of extend the notion of violence to include bureaucracy as some form of violence, you would probably have to argue that bureaucracy becomes violent when rules are being sort of followed blindly, precisely without the interpretive labor that is required probably to implement any rule, because rule following is a problem of context. Basically, you have to understand where and how, under what circumstances, certain rules could be correctly implemented, and that probably would require some more interpretive labor. And if you just ignore that and you're just a machine-like blindly rule-following bureaucrat, then you probably be also you'll have to be violent.
Yeah, and I think he's talking about structures that was set up in a different ways. So certain structures set up in a way where you cannot do interpretive labor, period. And that's how he's talking about in the beginning of the essay about death of his mom and his experience of trying to fill out forms. And by definition, he was put in a submissive position where he would do stupid things and everybody else also would do stupid things. But we started to talk about post office in our reading group, and that he's mentioning in the 5,000 years of death. And this is a different type of infrastructure, the post office at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, that is decentralized, and that is was compared by Marx, for example, to the beginning of the communism, and by Lenin too. So, so to my understanding, I don't know if I'm right, is that this type of infrastructure is actually run by people, and people can change the rules. Bureaucracy, in the sense of modern bureaucracy or Foucauldian bureaucracy or algorithms, they set up in a way that they are the rules. So there is no people required to run this infrastructure, because the infrastructure itself are the rules. And if it's if I'm right, then these algorithms, they almost, when they will develop more, they almost will be like a representation of the true God, like totally patriarchal true God that will be everywhere, will know everything about everybody. We cannot change it. We, by definition, cannot change it because the system is working. It's a machine, but we cannot fix it. It's the first machine that human being built that is not fixable, because we can fix the phone, we can unplug it and take it apart, but we cannot put apart even the algorithm of Facebook. Nobody control it because it's built on layers and layers with communicating with each other and not with us anymore. You know, they only one way communicating with us, but we cannot communicate with it. So that's a very interesting, kind of fascinating point.
You want to react to that, Dimitri?
Yeah, I just wanted to, sorry.
I just wanted to say that it's a very interesting, I think, distinction between sort of changeable and unchangeable rules. And post office, I don't know, but I think it's just you know, it's understandable why in the early 20th century people imagined communism as resembling a well-functioning German post office system. But I think the point with rules is sort of more important. So regardless of the particular ways of imagining how how communism should look like, probably now it's difficult to imagine it as in some way resembling a post office. But just the general principle that rules have to be changeable in some way has to remain, and I think that's really one of the essential features of communism as it was imagined by early Marx, for instance.
I think now also the other metaphor to replace post office would be Linux for communism, because Linux is also consists of the infrastructure and the rules, but these rules by definition changeable, and it's a very specific rules of how to change rules, and rules can be changed by anybody. Anybody can download Linux, create their own version of Linux and distribute it. And that's a part of the rules of how Linux exists. And coming back to the Museum of Care, that's, I think, the model for that. So it should have rules, and the rules have to be very strictly described, but part of the definition, part of the description should be possibility of changing these rules. And it specifically should be changed by humans who are capable to do interpretive labor.
Yeah, I mean, there is this prejudice by many people that anarchism, anarchists don't believe in rules, which is a bit obviously not true. It makes me think about something, talking about anarchism, and I don't know if it's the case anywhere else, but in France we have this injunction that we tell to kids that violence is the weapon of the weak. Have you heard that? That's something that, you know, we are told as children, parents tell all the time, and by this they actually mean, oh, you should actually talk to your siblings and try to settle the argument instead of like just hitting them. It makes a lot of sense. It also makes me think about another paper that David wrote that was called, it's a short essay about anarchism. It's not the book, it's called Are You an Anarchist? The Answer Might Surprise You. And he argues exactly that. He says, so yeah, if you take seriously all those things that your parents told you, like, you know, it doesn't matter who started it, or, you know, you have to clean your own mess and so on, then you're gonna arrive eventually at anarchism. And I've been doing just a little bit of a research just now, and apparently this violence is the weapon of the weak is actually a very famous quote, but it's a quote actually coming from the ABC of anarchism, wrote by Alexander Berkman, who's a very famous Russian-American anarchist, a good friend of Emma Goldman, and the full quote is actually the violence is violence is the method of ignorance the weapon of the weak. So that's actually quite interesting that, you know, violence is directly linked to ignorance. And interestingly as well, this book, The ABC of Anarchism, or Anarchy, I don't remember exactly, was written in France because he after the Bolshevik Revolution that didn't end exactly how he expected it to end. He just like he went to France and he actually finished his life there.
Cool. Maybe we should read this essay next time on our reading group, whenever it will be after the London School of Economic group.
Yeah, sure. And about bureaucracy, I had I was thinking about, you know, when in the last version of the paper, when contemplating the political implications of all this, David talks about those revolutionary or insurrectionary moments. You know, when this bureaucratic apparatus is neutralized, and he says, you know, it has tremendous effects on opening up our horizon of possibility, and what usually follows after that is like an outpouring of a social artistic creativity. Incidentally says that people often experience something very similar to that during natural disasters. So just like making me think about what the time we are living in at the moment with the virus. And although it's not exactly a natural disaster because it's probably as much human than natural caused disaster. This is interesting, and again, I'm sorry, again a French example, but in the French hospitals during the crisis, they did something interesting. Usually, there has been, like, just like in England, there had been reforms to make hospitals look like a little bit more companies. Corporations, and they have this activity cost activity-based or activity cost pricing or activity-based pricing. It's basically you want to limit the costs of each activity in the hospital. So there is, you know, it always comes with a tremendous amount of bureaucratic of bureaucracy and filling forms and so on. And during the crisis, they said, "Oh, fuck all that. We're going to cure people at all costs. So you don't bother filling the forms. It's just it's all right." And that, you know, I suppose that nurses, doctors, having experienced this after the crisis, won't be able to go back to the normal bureaucracy. And again, you know, it's about opening up your horizons, and I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, so maybe we should just publish this first time and see if it's gonna work, and we can try to do it after every reading group. Huh? Yeah. So let's.
All right, let's try it.
Okay.
Okay.